Hello, this is Senator Ben Cardin. Welcome to Facebook Live, an opportunity that I utilize on a somewhat regular basis to go over a current issue on Facebook Live to give you an opportunity to hear what's happening in Washington. These are very exciting times. We are within the first few weeks of the Biden administration. There's a lot of excitement here on the Hill, a lot of hearings on nominations for President Biden's cabinet. We have a COVID relief package that's making its way through the Congress that'll be on the floor next week. And there is lots of discussion about President Biden's Build Back Better, what his plans are going to be for rebuilding America, the infrastructure needs, et cetera. I am honored that in this Congress, I will not only serve on the Authorizing Committee for Transportation, the Environment and Public Works Committee, but I will chair the Infrastructure Subcommittee. So I will be directly involved, particularly on the transportation infrastructure agenda. So this program is going to be, I think, helpful for the people of Maryland, but also helpful for me because we have two experts who will share their thoughts. We have Eulois Cleckley, who is the Executive Director of the Denver Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, and John Porcari, who is the former Secretary of the Department of Transportation in the state of Maryland and the former Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Transportation. So we have experts from how to get it done at the local level, how to get it done at the state level, how to get it done at the federal level. So welcome. Let me start just with a general question. Build Back Better, state of play for infrastructure in America. We hear frequently about the need, but can you just share with me what you see as the state of infrastructure in America? Do we have a crisis? Does it require substantial investment in order to modernize our infrastructure? Where would you place this on a scale of how urgent it is for us to pass a major infrastructure initiative? And Eulois, I'll start with you. Give me your perspective, particularly from the point of view of our municipalities and local governments.
Definitely, I appreciate the question, and thank you again, Senator Hardin, for the invitation today to speak about this pressing topic around infrastructure and transportation. On a scale of 1 to 10, I would put it at almost a 9. I think that the opportunity that we have to really change the fabric of our transportation infrastructure is right in front of us. Our cities have grown tremendously over the past 50 or 60 years. We've struggled with the revenue streams to be able to support the need to build out infrastructure to support our growth. And then we know all of these other historical elements that's really impacted the way our infrastructure has been built out, designed for, in terms of how it's impacted communities from a negative standpoint, how it's created limited access for communities of color and the like, how it's really focused on the automobile, moving people around as opposed to a multimodal way of getting around. We have to change the dynamic of our infrastructure and at the same time replace our aging infrastructure and the elements that really need attention from a maintenance standpoint. And so I know a lot of localities are very excited about this opportunity, the new administration and the new thought and philosophy around how we can build our infrastructure moving forward, how building our infrastructure can help spur the economy from a local, regional, statewide, and national effort, and how we can really re-envision and modernize our transportation system to make it the best system that can move all people, regardless of what mode that they choose, in the most safe and effective manner.
So, John, you're familiar with both Maryland and the nation. Maryland has a consolidated trust fund that can be utilized for any mode of transportation. So I assume we got all of our needs met in the state of Maryland.
It's a great question, Senator Cardin, but and you well know the answer that we have a lot more work to do. But this really is a generational opportunity, and if you think about infrastructure, you can look at how the American Society of Civil Engineers grades us at a D or a C for different parts of infrastructure. But more generally, you can go any place in America and look at the major pieces of infrastructure. And the odds are that our parents or grandparents, or sometimes our great-grandparents, bought and paid for that, and we've been living off of that. And the larger generational opportunity is we really need to pay it forward. Transportation is a means to an end, not an end in itself. And if we want economic development, if we want to build better communities, if we want to tackle the existential challenge of climate change, if we want a more equitable society, it starts with a more equitable infrastructure. And those are the challenges ahead of us. It's clear that this is a time for innovation. Building back better means, in part, doing things differently and smarter. And as the co-chair of then candidate Biden's Infrastructure Policy Committee, those are the kinds of issues that we really tackled. And so it's whether it's in Maryland or anywhere in the nation, those issues can't wait. If we're going to have a better future for our children and grandchildren, we need to do much more.
You raise a very good point. We got to build and we got to do it better, which is what President Biden is suggesting. Before COVID-19, I can tell you that my 45-mile commute between my home in Baltimore and working on Capitol Hill at the U.S. Capitol took me somewhere between 2 hours and 15 minutes and 2 hours and 30 minutes by car. Now, there's not many good things I can say about COVID-19, but that commute's been made a lot easier as a result of COVID-19. So yes, you're right. The question I asked you, we have desperate needs in our state for transportation improvements. There are certain bridges in our state that my staff is reluctant to have me drive over. They're concerned about the safety. And these are some of our major bridges, such as the Johnson Bridge and the Nice Bridge. And you know about other bridges that are past their life expectancy, that they really need to be replaced. And then talk about the transit systems that we have in our state and how we have to move people more efficiently. So we have tremendous needs in Maryland, and there's tremendous needs around the nation. But let's talk about the better part of this for one moment. And that was the question that I was trying to get at yesterday. We had a hearing yesterday before the Environment and Public Works Committee. We had a distinguished panel before us, including Governor Hogan of Maryland. I asked Governor Hogan a question about the equities of the federal transportation program. We had Mayor Hancock of Denver. So we had two people who were very familiar with this. And at that point, Governor Hogan was talking about the investments we're making in Maryland. And I wanted to concentrate for a moment in Baltimore City, because the economic opportunities that can be brought by transportation are more limited in Baltimore City. We do not have a rapid rail transportation system in Baltimore. As you know, we have two lines, but we don't have a rapid rail transportation system. And the governor touts the private-public partnerships. Well, they work in certain areas, but they don't necessarily work in our urban centers. So as we look at building back better, and I'm going to start with the challenges that you might have in Denver, how do we put into the program this equity issue to make sure all communities can benefit? Because we're talking about $1 trillion investments. How do we make sure it gets to the communities that really need it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And quite frankly, a lot of cities are trying to tackle this issue and concern with trying to have the current investment go to the proper neighborhoods that need it the most, and understand what really equity means. And what we've done here in Denver is we've kind of distilled this down to make it very practical, pragmatic, and implementable. And our definition here for my department is that the assets and the areas of the city where people live, you measure that to figure out the condition of those assets and the areas and where the people live. And if those assets are in poor condition, you allocate proper resources to those assets. So the assets could be roadways, it could be bridges, it could be transit lines, service improvements, and the like. The way that you get to the equity issue is you end up collecting data on those three main things. So it's as much of an asset management exercise as opposed as a subjective exercise to try to figure out how to target funds. And so what we've done here in Denver to help kind of lead our capital improvement program investment decisions moving forward, as well as our capital maintenance program, which both of those combined equal about $120 million annually. And that's on top of our $937 million bond that we have, which about $430 million of that are associated with transportation projects over the next 10 years. We really went through a robust equity analysis, came up with an equity index where we apply it to each and every one of our 78 neighborhoods, and it's a comparative measure. And now I can be able to tell you which neighborhoods need the most attention from an asset management standpoint, and we target our investment that way. And so we started to do this about 2 years ago. As a result, our last year's budget, we had almost 70% of our capital improvement investment, as well as a capital maintenance program, go to those areas that are in the most need, which what we call is a high equity index area. So it's really trying to figure out how to translate the idea and the concept of equitable investment to something that you can actually implement, and you do it by collecting data and information and then applying it on the front end when you're making your budget decisions and how you prioritize your projects moving forward.
Eulois, I want to go over a point that I raised with Mayor Hancock. Mayor Hancock, in his testimony yesterday, pointed out, let us have discretion. And you're talking about how you want to allocate that. You have to have an ability at the local level to make those types of decisions to deal with the equity considerations. So you really do have to have flexibility on the use of funds. Most of our transportation funds go through formula funding through the state, and it is a challenge at times for the local governments to be able to make the decisions like you are referring to on the equities to communities. I am the author of the Transportation Alternative Programs. My partner on this is Senator Wicker in Mississippi. It's bipartisan. It's an effort to make sure that there is monies available for local governments to deal with the needs of their community. In some cases, it's to connect communities together. John knows that we use transportation money in Baltimore to connect different neighborhoods together through the different trails and through so that communities that were isolated are now connected, and there's safe ways of getting between neighborhoods. So we need to make sure as we go through this that you have the discretion to be able to implement such a policy. And Mayor Hancock strongly endorsed the transportation alternative programs, and we want to make sure it's included in the next round of the infrastructure transportation bill.
Absolutely. And Senator, if you don't mind, I would like to kind of piggyback on that just as an example. So Denver is one county in the state of Colorado. We equate to about 90% of the GDP. We have about 83% of the population. When you look at the distribution from the Highway Users Trust Fund, we get about 36% that comes to the Denver metro region. So that gives you an idea of kind of what I think is what a lot of local mayors and cities are trying to fight for, is allow us to kind of control our own destiny and allow us to manage our network that moves the majority of the people within the most economically kind of vibrant area within a state or jurisdiction. And local leaders and mayors will always know the best investment decisions moving forward. And so we're going to continue to address that. I also represent the National Association of City Transportation Officials, and that's a collaboration of different transportation directors. And we are clamoring for the same thing. It'll just allow us to have that division of labor to take place, like Mayor Hancock mentioned yesterday, have the states focus on kind of the inner city network and allow the local leaders to manage this own infrastructure in the most proper way. And the way to do that is really increasing investment in the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program that currently exists, but just add more money into it so it can get directly to local jurisdictions.
John, we had a governor who started what was known as smart growth, Governor Glendenning. And his policies were to use the transportation programs to encourage smart community growth that made it easier for development and residential life and less congestion on the roads. How do we implement such types of equity issues in a national funding bill so that local governments can do those types of initiatives and the economics of those issues are not at a disadvantage because of the federal funding formulas?
It's a great question, Senator. And as you point out in the Maryland example with smart growth, which, as you recall, was very controversial when it first started, we took the entire state capital program and ran it through a filter of whether it was consistent with smart growth. And a number of projects came out of the capital program because of that. Others were added. It underscores a larger point, which is there's this common misconception that innovation is at the federal transportation level and kind of trickles down to the local level from there. It's the opposite. The innovation actually happens at the local level and bubbles up. And part of what you'll see with the Biden administration's transportation program is watching and recognizing that local innovation and capturing the best of it. And in practical terms, one of the ways that you do that is the block grant programs, as Director Cleckley mentioned, but beyond that, competitive grant programs. If you think about the Tiger Grant program that was part of the Recovery Act, and the fact that that was the direct grants to local jurisdictions that were done on a benefit cost basis, they were ranked on a benefit cost basis. Well, if you insert climate change and equity as two values in that evaluation process, you'll end up with a very different project mix. And you'll end up with projects, most of which are twofers in the sense that they address climate change and are building a more equitable future, and ideally redressing some of the past inequities that our transportation system has imposed. So there are practical ways to do that. One further one that I'd suggest, and I don't want to nerd out too much here, but the NEPA process, the National Environmental Policy Act, for environmental impact statements and environmental alternatives, if you build into the purpose and need of the project directly addressing climate change and equity, they can be funded as part of the project. You don't take the purpose and need like you did in the old days and just say it's to move people quicker from one place to another. There's also larger objectives, and it really calls for rethinking that portion of the NEPA process so that the projects embrace larger values that address these two big challenges we have in front of us as a nation. And I think infrastructure in general and transportation in particular are some of the best ways that we can actually address those challenges.
So about 2 weeks ago, I was in the Oval Office with President Biden. It was a group of senators, Democrats and Republicans, the chair of our committee, Senator Carper, the ranking Republican, Senator Capito, and the chair and ranking on the subcommittee on transportation, Senator Inhofe, and myself. So the four of us were in the White House. It was the president was encouraging us on an infrastructure package to be bipartisan. He talked about the needs for transportation, but he went beyond transportation and to other areas of infrastructure. So recognizing the current political environment, what is your hope on the type of an infrastructure package at this particular moment in our history where an opportunity presents itself? What should we be looking for? What should be our mission, and how large of a package do you think is realistic in this current political environment? John?
Senator, I think we should go big. And one of the lessons that we learned together in the Recovery Act in 2009 was that if the package itself is not big enough, it can't be transformative. And you want both this high-low mix of projects. At the low end, some of the projects that you could do right away that will put people back to work right away, that mean local employment, that can be used for job training. And at the high end, the transformative projects. It's clear that this package needs to be much larger than the Recovery Act was. It also needs to be broader. This is infrastructure writ large, so we should not just be talking about transportation in a vacuum. The transportation right-of-ways, for example, are some of the best assets out there for broadband. And one of the things we've all learned the hard way during this pandemic is that we have school children all over the country that live in a digital divide. Well, that road and transit and railroad right-of-way can actually bring broadband to underserved communities. Likewise, we can transmit renewable energy through high voltage DC in the right-of-way. And so the larger point is we should think big and broadly about how we use all of the assets that we have, and look forward to what we're going to need 20, 30, 40 years from now as we're putting these projects together.
Director Cleckley?
Yes, Senator, I appreciate the question, and just to piggyback off of what John was mentioning, what most people don't understand is that the street kind of conveys not only people, it moves people, it moves the things that people purchase, or the things that we waste, and it also through our utility system underneath the street, it moves information. So from broadband to stormwater and the like, and so it's. Even though at the end product is a street and a sidewalk, it's a part of a whole entire fabric and network of infrastructure that moves people, things, and things like water as well. And so one of the things that we ended up figuring out as our new Department of Transportation and Infrastructure is how to leverage those assets to build things much more efficient through kind of a one build strategy, right? You go into a specific neighborhood if you need to fix the street and the sidewalk, and if you also need to fix the sewer, sanitary systems do it at one time. But all of those systems also have the opportunity in a larger infrastructure package coming from the federal government to address climate as well at the same time that you're fixing transportation infrastructure and utilities. One issue that we have here in Denver is with all of the new development, we are seeing a significant increase in impervious areas and surfaces. And so that creates flooding. And so we've had to go back in and figure out ways to have monumental projects to build out the backbone of our stormwater system, which nobody will ever see at the end of the day. But when there's a 100-year flood event, we're able to now capture that water and move almost 80% of the houses in the most underserved area in Denver out of the floodplain. So it's things like that I think if we look at infrastructure package in its totality, all types of infrastructure assets, regardless if it's transportation or not, you have truly an opportunity to be bold and really fix a lot of the long-standing historical issues that a lot of cities have had through previous kind of poor transportation design.
So let me just agree with your assessment of going bold. We have had some test votes in the last Congress. In the Environment and Public Works Committee, we passed a transportation reauthorization bill, a 5-year bill, that had a significant increase over the previous 5 years. And that bill contained several issues that could have been divisive, not for me, but for some members. For example, dealing with climate change, or dealing with transportation alternative programs, or dealing with electric cars, or dealing with resiliency. The vote in our committee was unanimous. Every single member, Democrat and Republican, and remember how divisive the last Congress was along party line. But then we also had the Water Resources Development Act, the WRDA Act, which dealt with our water infrastructure for safe, clean drinking water, as well as dealing with wastewater. And that bill also provided some additional resources. And once again, the size of that package was unanimously approved by the Environment and Public Works Committee. And then we had several votes on broadband. And before COVID-19, we knew we had a problem with accessibility to high-speed internet, but COVID-19 really brought that to light. And those parts of the package of COVID relief that dealt with broadband were widely accepted by the members of the United States Senate. So we have seen the framework for a bipartisan bill that would go bold in regards to certainly broadband, transportation, water infrastructure. We could also talk about other infrastructure needs, such as our schools. And I always have to mention that because in Baltimore City, we still have schools in which it's not safe for children to drink out of the water fountains because of lead contamination. And we are seeing as children are trying to get back into the classroom, we have many school buildings that are inadequate to deal with their needs. They're too crowded, and the ventilation systems are not adequate to deal with a normal circumstances, but certainly not COVID-19. So we do need to do infrastructure when it comes to where we house our most precious people, our young people. And then, of course, we have the energy infrastructure that you mentioned, Director, that we have to look at how we're going to deal with our energy needs as we go through all this. And if anything, Texas showed us that there's vulnerability in the way that we have built infrastructure for energy in our country. So as we look at infrastructure, there's a whole broad need out there. And quite frankly, I think it's not difficult to get broad bipartisan consensus on a bold size of an infrastructure package. The question is, how do you pay for it? Now, if you have the answer to that, you should run for the United States Senate, because this is an area where we're having a challenging time bringing us together. So if you have some suggestions for us, I'll start with John Porcari, because I don't believe you're running for office anytime soon, but if you are, then you don't have to answer this question. But do you have some suggestions on how we're going to pay for all this?
It is the question, Senator, and no, I'm not running for office, so I can be bold here. One is, since the gas tax has not been raised since 1993, although it's a declining revenue source over time as we electrify the transportation sector, as a short-term prop to prop up part of the Transportation Trust Fund, it's a good tool. The pay-as-you-go, the mileage-based user fees are being tested on pilot basis in several states right now. It's a great example of where policy innovation happens at the local and state level. That's another alternative as well. And I would also say we should not be afraid, given the unprecedented low cost of borrowing for major projects that are going to have a lifespan of 50 or 75 years, to borrow on a 20 or 30 or 40-year basis capital dollars to build these projects that are going to serve us for generations. That should be part of the mix as well. And all three of those financial sources are, I think, critical elements of it. It's worth pointing out that at the local and state level, jurisdictions all across the country have raised revenues, either through referenda, through gas tax increase, or indexing at the state level. Not a single governor has lost his or her job over that issue. The difference, I believe, in part, is at the local and state level, you're showing exactly which projects the voters are getting for their hard-earned tax dollars. And if you're smart, you underpromise and overdeliver. You make sure you deliver on those specific projects, and you do it faster than you said you would. So funding is a critical issue. I think the larger issue is restarting our economy and rebuilding it in a better way, and taking this very unique point in time when we're actually applying a climate change and an equity lens to what we've done in the past, and doing it differently in the future.
Eulois, you want to take a crack at this, or are you thinking about running for office?
I'm not thinking about running for office just yet. I think I'm as close to the sun as what I need to be there. So, but I would have to agree with John that, you know, and one thing that we can definitely would like to encourage, not necessarily here in Denver, but in other localities, is kind of freeing up the authority to do some type of pricing mechanism on the existing infrastructure. So congestion pricing, or other type of pricing type of pilots that can be allowed by local jurisdictions, where they have the autonomy through whatever means to actually implement that, will actually help to actually raise revenues that can go into that specific infrastructure. So that's something that I know is one of the platforms from again, NACTO that I represent on, and something that I know a lot of local jurisdictions would be very interested in. And I do think that having the opportunity to figure out bonding mechanisms and leveraging existing revenue is going to have to be a lot of the need and requirement to create funding stacks to deliver projects effectively. I know. As an example, and here in Denver, we're actually redoing what we call our 16th Street pedestrian and transit way. It's a historical piece of infrastructure. It's outfitted with about 40 years worth of granite, and we're actually just got approved benefits through the NEPA process last year, and we're moving forward with redoing that project. And we had to figure out a way to pay for it, and it's a $150 million project. We have about 40% of it as a part of a TIF, so tax increment of financing that we're able to use for the project. We only received about 9% of federal dollars from our project, really from FTA, and then we received about almost 20% or so, or actually 13% from the state to help deliver that project, and the rest were on our bond program and our sales and use taxes that we use to fund our CIP. So, and that's just for one project. So think about an entire $1 billion worth of assets that we need to move forward with. So I think it's a difficult discussion to have, but really, again, I keep going back to allow the jurisdictions to implement, those pricing schemes to raise the proper revenue from a user standpoint.
My guest today on Facebook Live, Eulois Cleckley, who is the director of the Denver Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, and John Porcari, the former Secretary of the Department of Transportation in Maryland and the former Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Transportation. So before we leave the financing issues, you all are really talking about some creative ways for financing, which we do need. As you know, Congress authorized the TIFIA program for transportation, the WIFIA program for water resources. That does leverage borrowing, and it does allow us to leverage for more infrastructure, paying for it over a longer period of time that, John, you were mentioning. And we are looking at some of the more innovative usage fees, including the per mile on your cars, and looking at alternative sources for transportation revenues. And we're also looking at the price of carbon, which is one of the areas that is gaining more and more popularity. So there are several issues that we can take a look at in an effort to try to deal with the funding. But I want to throw one more issue on the table on funding, and then I want to try to move on to the climate issue and how we deal with that with infrastructure. And that is, as you know, we have in Congress passed two major relief bills for COVID-19, the CARES Act that we passed in mid-March, and then this past December, we passed the omnibus legislation with additional COVID relief, recognizing that our economy needed help in its recovery. It is clear that our economy is going to continue to need additional help beyond the legislation being considered next week, this week in the House, next week in the Senate, for the $1.9 trillion package the president has asked for. We're going to need to come out of this COVID pandemic with job growth, because there's jobs that have been lost permanently as a result of COVID-19. I know that a lot of my colleagues believe that if we invest in infrastructure, we create good paying jobs, we put money into the economy, and we come out with a more modern, competitive environment in which to work. So one of the issues I think we need to talk about, yes, we have to make sure that we have adequate funding for ongoing transportation needs in this country and infrastructure needs in this country, but why don't we take advantage of the type of help that's necessary to come out of COVID-19 to create jobs by doing that by making investments in infrastructure? I see you both nodding your head. I'm going to take that as an approval, but if you want to add more comments, feel free. John, anything else you want to add on that?
Yeah, Senator, it's a great point, because again, part of doing it better, turning infrastructure into a twofer or a threefer, is to make sure that there are local jobs in it. It's to make sure that there are job training programs so people can climb the skills ladder as part of that project as well. And there are great examples around the country. At LA Metro, for example, through the transit construction, there are people that I've met and talked to that have literally gone from the street, living on the street, to actually a full-time job through the course of that project. and you can replicate that around the country. So we should recognize that there's a lot more you can do. Likewise, on the economic development front, right down the street in Director Cleckley's hometown, Denver Union Station, the TIFIA and RIF loan programs made that project happen. And using both of those loans on top of each other in a capital stack actually permitted that project to proceed. And that's a good example of a project that'll be there 50 or 100 years from now. That's a good investment now in economic development and will pay off for generations.
Eulois, anything else you want to add on that?
Yeah, sure. And the Union Station project was, I think, first of its kind to create that kind of commingling between federal dollars and grant programs and the like. I would just say, Senator, that one of the things that we're very interested in here in Denver is figuring out, again, how can infrastructure allow for good paying jobs with a target on the folks that need good and gainful employment. And the one thing that we've kind of baked in is how can we now leverage this opportunity to develop workforce development programs, which traditionally has not been a part of a funding package for transportation. I think it's primarily less than 1% of those funds are dedicated toward a workforce development program. So in figuring out ways to incentivize local jurisdictions to work with different partners to encourage localized hiring programs, or even requiring them on specific projects, is something I know we would be very interested in. And we've started to bake some of those workforce development programs in our major kind of capital investment projects. And it's seen some significant benefits where we've been able to hire folks locally and for certain targeted populations, whether it be folks that are just coming out of being incarcerated for whatever reason, or folks that have been homeless for whatever reason, or just people who are underemployed, that they've been able to leverage our workforce development programs to get a long-term job and transition that into a career. So I would encourage any look at a large, bold reauthorization bill and investment in transportation that there's some incentives baked in on really helping to train the workforce of the future.
That's a really good point. There's no question that it can be utilized for more than just the construction of infrastructure itself. We have a question from Dave, who's watching on Facebook Live, which is really a good question. It gives me the transition into the climate issue. Dave's taking issue with one of my suggestions that you would perhaps be charged on a per mile basis, where he says, look, if you're trying to encourage alternative fuel vehicles, such as electric cars, why would you then charge the same for an electric car and a gas car for the mileage used? Shouldn't there be sensitivity to the climate agenda as we look at building back better? Excellent question. I'm glad I have two experts who can answer this for me. John, how do we put climate change and our energy policy into our transportation priorities?
It's a key question, Senator. And Dave, you're pointing out one short-term potential issue with vehicle miles travel tax. There's an inequity built in right now where in many states, electric vehicles, because they're not buying fuel, are not paying for road usage at all. That actually helps incentivize electric vehicle usage. And the larger issue, and I know we'll be talking about this, Senator, is that as the single biggest contributor to CO2 as a sector, transportation needs to electrify rapidly across the board. And there are some very important strategies associated with doing that. But there is no perfectly equitable way of paying for that infrastructure. Some are better than others. The vehicle mile tax, which can be adjusted in different ways, for example, using the congestion pricing mechanism as an overlay on that for the most congested urban areas would be one way to make it a little more equitable. But the larger issue is if we want to move away from a fossil fuel economy, we have to transition from the gas tax as a revenue source. And vehicle mile tax and congestion pricing are two ways that we can actually do that. That may not be perfect, but they are certainly pushing policy in the right direction.
Of course, one of the best ways to transition away from fossil fuel transportation policy is to invest in public transportation, where we can control the use of energy as well as have more efficiencies in transporting people. So is Denver confronting the issue of transit? Is that part of your strategy moving forward? How does that fit into our commitment for a cleaner environment?
Absolutely. Transit is the great equalizer, if you really think about it from a mobility and equity standpoint. And so we have a great partner in RTD, Regional Transportation District here, is a regional transit provider who has built out the major infrastructure that John mentioned earlier at Denver Union Station. We've been partnering with them on our 16th Street Avenue, our 16th Street pedestrian mall project and transitway project, like I mentioned before. And then we are, as a city, going to heavily invest in the transit for meeting localized transit needs moving forward. And so as an example, we are in the process of entering into our NEPA phase of project development for Denver's first ever bus rapid transit piece of infrastructure, which is going to be on Colfax, which is about a 6.2 mile stretch that goes east-west and runs through downtown, and will end up connecting to major activity centers along the corridor, as well as intermodal hubs, such as Civic Center Station and the like. That's around $200 to $400 million project. And so we're trying to figure out the best ways to design that effectively and figure out, again, the funding stack to be able to deliver that major capital project. But we're also going to step into delivering our own transit services moving forward, with the understanding that RTD is a regional transit provider. So it's very difficult for them to meet the local needs from a transit perspective. And so we are in the process of testing out micro mobility options from small kind of on-demand shuttles in some of our most needy neighborhoods to get people to and fro. And we're also looking at what we call, even though it's not necessarily what you think about transit, but it's another innovative transportation mode that we're encouraging, which is the use of scooters and e-bikes and the like, and how to link all of that into the transit system and really create multimodal hubs within a block or 5-minute walk where everybody lives, regardless of where you are in the city. And so my vision is that when you walk out of your house, you should be able to look one way, look the other way, and you go to a spot. And if you want to use a bike, use transit for that day, or use whatever mode, you should be able to do so and have that great accessibility available to you. So yes, transit is key. Even though we saw a dip, during COVID times, it's starting to rebound, and we know that it's going to rebound fully, and we need to be prepared to accommodate all these additional trips and then move people on these alternative modes so we can discourage people from driving by themselves to where they need to go.
There's no question that transit's been challenged because of COVID-19, because of the large number of people that would be close together. We had to avoid that. So as part of our COVID relief package, we have provided help for the transit systems in the nation. I don't believe we have provided enough help, and we're still looking at ways that we can provide additional assistance because it's been a real struggle. In Maryland, we are very much into public transportation. We have the expansion of the Purple Line in the Washington area for rapid rail. Baltimore, as I said earlier, has basically 2 lines of rapid rail. The red line was not approved by Governor Hogan. I disagreed with that decision. Of course, we have MARC service, which is critically important for commuter rail between a good part of our state, more than Baltimore to Washington. It goes beyond that. And then, of course, Amtrak is critically important to our entire country, but particularly to the East Coast of the United States. So we have a rail transit system, and there is, of course, the current efforts to duplicate some of the high-speed passenger rail that we see in Asia here on the East Coast of the United States. So, John, seems to me transit and rail need to be part of any major infrastructure package.
Yeah, they really do, Senator. There's no substitute as a critical part of the mix of transit and rail. It has to be right at the center of it. As you pointed out with the COVID-19 relief bill, we've provided some triage to the transit systems to keep them operating in the short term. What we need to do is build from there that virtuous cycle of steady, reliable service, shorter headways, and connecting people to the opportunities of today, not yesterday. So we have transit systems throughout the country that in some cases need to be reset as employment patterns change, as populations shift, and that is really not keeping up with demand. We also need to think about rationalizing our transportation system in a larger sense with transit and rail. So if you're a state DOT secretary and you can get 90% federal money by formula for a new runway or taxiway between Baltimore and New York, and you can get 80% federal money by formula for I-95 between Baltimore and New York,
Yeah.
and you can get 0% federal money by formula for Amtrak and commuter rail service between Baltimore and New York, which one are you going to choose? So leveling those policy options is important, and every state, every region make different decisions based on their local needs, which is how it should be. But what we have done as a nation is we've put our thumb on the scales, favoring aviation for short trips, for example, when rail would make more sense, making transit much harder to do in practice than additional highway capacity. And if we're going to get serious about climate change and a response to it, and if we're going to change the future, we have to change the way that we are funding our transportation system and the way that the funds are allocated.
Absolutely, I agree with you. We have another YouTube comment about, as we've been talking more and more about the equity issues, don't forget rural America. And absolutely, we recognize that the road programs are critically important, as is, by the way, public transit in rural communities, connecting rural communities. Absolutely. And the question specifically mentions the Appalachia Development Highway System, which we have been very actively engaged in to give additional opportunities for Pennsylvania to use toll facilities and toll revenues as part of their funding of it. And I can assure you that the Environment and Public Works Committee is not going to ignore the Appalachia region, with Senator Capito as the ranking Republican member from West Virginia on the committee, and with a senator from Maryland as the chair of the Infrastructure Committee. We're going to continue to pay attention to those transportation needs. Eulois, while I have you here, I want to talk about safety just for one moment, because I've been told that you have a goal to eliminate fatalities by 2030. Did I read that correctly in the backup that was given to me by staff? How are you going to do that? Good for you. Talk to me a little bit about safety, because this is one area that I really do think we need to deal with in an infrastructure bill. The number of bicycle accidents are increasing in many communities, and we are trying to do things for bicycle safety. And again, the transportation alternative programs directly fund bicycle safety issues. But what is your strategy for reducing the number of fatalities on the highway?
Yeah, definitely. I really appreciate that question. And yes, you're correct. We do have a very bold and aggressive goal by getting down to 0 fatalities on our roadways by 2030. So got quite a ways to go. Just as background, we had 51 fatalities last year, even though with the significant reduction in people traveling around our roadways. The year before, we had 71 fatalities, and already this year we're at 11. So we're trending to go back up again to kind of high 70s. So it is, I think, for every single city, metropolitan area, it is the #1 priority that we are trying to address: safety. We still have over 38,000 people dying on our roadways on an annual basis, and we have to figure out better ways to integrate better design, safer design, and think much bolder than just status quo. And with the fact that we have some of our cities that are growing out and their land use is changing, you're creating a greater interaction between pedestrians, bicyclists, and the vehicle. And our goal here is to not only accelerate our what we call our Vision Zero program, which is trying to get down to zero fatalities, but do it in a manner where we are allocating and reallocating current street infrastructure, the right of way, to be able to accommodate different modes of transportation. So all the bike lanes that we're building out in the city and county of Denver, the enhancements to our sidewalks, the kind of condensing down of the space around our intersections to make it much easier for pedestrians to cross, implementing new technologies to allow for the recognition of pedestrians and bicyclists that can be integrated into kind of the future generation of vehicles. All of these things are what we're doing now here in Denver. And we're doing it in an aggressive manner. And of all the things that we can definitely use additional funding for, it is to go to enhancing the safety and the majority of our corridors that are causing the highest rates of fatalities. We have 5 streets in Denver that equal about 50% of the fatalities in the city and county of Denver. And it's a mix between state facilities that we actually maintain, as well as local roadways. And I would say about 80% of the 5% of the roads that equal to 50% of the fatalities are in areas where we have, again, the high equity index neighborhoods. And so when you fix safety, tangentially, it ends up being an improvement to how you're addressing equity from a modal standpoint as well as from an individual personal standpoint. So we need help in this regard. And I think the help that we can get is really revisioning what not to get too technical, but just the design standards that really are imparted on us as states or local jurisdictions that come down from federal highway through the MUTCD, which is the design manual. We got to think a little bit bigger and a little bit bolder and be more nimble and think outside of the box so we can safely move, again, everybody, regardless of the mode that they choose.
That's so exciting. John, there's so many aspects that go into safety. Yes, we have the design of our infrastructure itself. We have technology and the carriers, the cars, the vehicles that are used. It's the training for people who are involved in transportation. I have visited a company in Maryland that has developed the technology for being able to park vehicles without a driver, and that it's much safer. They've shown that they can get down to zero accidents in parking lots. We do know that the technologies that have been put in vehicles that automatically bring cars to a stop or warn you when you're changing lanes. There's a lot going on. I know you're involved in technology, so can we make a significant dent in accidents on our transportation systems through incentives in an infrastructure bill?
Yes, we certainly can, Senator. And first, it's worth pointing out that some of the highest accident rates are actually in rural areas as well. So we need an all-of-the-above solution that, for example, is deploying cable barriers and safety edge and design elements in rural areas as well as urban areas. But we can incentivize safety, and part of it is, as you point out, technology deployment in the short term with existing systems without having to re-engineer an entire city or county. You can actually deploy safety elements that make transit safer and more effective, that have less distracted drivers, which is part of it as well, and their design elements. So all of those things, data is the key element that drives it. I'm sure that Eulois, like every other director, is looking at the accident data and driving his funding there to actually address those issues. And some of the chronic safety issues that are a little bit higher cost can be actually addressed in some of the capital projects that we're talking about. So, and as we get to more micromobility, more bicycles and pedestrians, more active transportation, people walking, for example, we need to be smarter about making sure it's safe to cross the street. We need to be smarter about the kinds of behaviors and micromobility devices that people are in roads with right now. So all of those should be addressed holistically, and there are specific technologies that help with each of those. The flexibility at the local and state level to deploy those countermeasures is really important.
Well, that's an area that I will really want to work on in this infrastructure initiative. One final comment, if I might, from each of you. COVID-19, what are the lessons learned coming out of COVID-19? We know that the workforce will never exactly be the same as it was before, telework's becoming much more popular. As we look at an infrastructure bill, how do we program in the impact of COVID-19?
I'll be happy to take a stab at that, Senator. First, resiliency in the broadest sense of the term is truly important. So our transit systems have shown that they can be and are resilient. We need to make sure that they're whatever the next black swan event is, whether it's a pandemic, a weather event, longer term effects of climate change, we need to make sure that our infrastructure is both physically and operationally resilient in a way that it typically isn't now. That costs more upfront. That changes your design decisions. But over the life cycle, it certainly pays for itself.
And I have an initiative on resiliency on infrastructure that we started before COVID-19. Eulois, you get the last word on this issue.
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate it. I think one of the things that we learned here in Denver is that we can be nimble. We can address the needs from a mobility perspective from our residents. But the one major effort that we accelerated was actually creating a shared street program where we essentially took our several segments of our local network and transitioned them into a shared street where people can actually walk, bike, and can slow vehicles down along these streets at a time where people needed to get out of their house during the stay-at-home restrictions. And so by pivoting very quickly to implement that, we learned a whole host of design elements that we want to implement throughout the city to encourage the use of bike and folks walking at a higher level, and at the same time still accommodate vehicles and slow the vehicles down. The biggest thing that we saw through the pandemic is that less people on the roadway equal less congestion, and people start speeding. So figuring out ways to use that as an opportunity to understand those design elements is something that we're going to move forward with.
Well, let me thank both of you. This has been a very, very exciting program, and Build Back Better really does present a great opportunity for America. I look at it as a way of helping our economy, to help job growth, including job training that you've mentioned several times. I look at it as a way to have America more competitive and a safer way that we can get through our communities, a smarter way of life, a friendlier way towards our environment. All those are certainly possible by Build Back Better. And we have a chance to do it. We should be bold. We should move forward and get this done right. And I think the American people strongly support this effort. And I hope that we'll follow some of the good advice that the two of you have given me. My guests today have been Eulois Cleckley, who is the Executive Director of the Denver Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, and John Porcari, the former Secretary of the Maryland Department of Transportation and Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Transportation. So thank you both for joining me today, and thank you all for joining us on Facebook Live.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate it.
You guys are good.
It was fun.